In the autumn of 2022, medical historian Dr. Rebecca Morrison discovered a collection of disturbing medical photographs while cataloguing the archives of the abandoned Willowbrook Sanatorium in rural Vermont. Among the deteriorating glass plate negatives dating from 1915 was an image that would revolutionize understanding of one of America's most mysterious epidemics and challenge everything the medical community believed about infectious disease transmission. The photograph showed a patient in the sanatorium's isolation ward, a gaunt figure with hollow, staring eyes that seemed to bore into the viewer's soul. What made Dr. Morrison examine the image more closely was not the patient's obvious illness, but rather subtle anomalies in their appearance that became visible only when the century-old photograph was digitally enhanced and magnified. Dark vein-like markings spread across the patient's skin in patterns that resembled no known disease, while their eyes reflected light in ways that suggested profound physiological changes that had never been documented in medical literature. The discovery would lead to the reopening of one of epidemiology's most puzzling cases, the investigation into what contemporary medical records had called the Willowbrook wasting, a mysterious epidemic that had claimed over 300 lives in Vermont and surrounding states during 1915 and 1916 before vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a specialist in historical epidemiology at the Centers for Disease Control, was contacted when preliminary research revealed that the patient in the photograph might represent the first documented case of a disease that had been systematically covered up by medical authorities and government officials who feared its implications for public health and social stability. The Willowbrook Sanatorium had been established in 1889 as a progressive treatment facility for patients suffering from tuberculosis, mental illness, and other chronic conditions that required long-term medical care. Built in the hills of central Vermont, the facility had been designed according to the latest theories about therapeutic environments, featuring extensive grounds where patients could benefit from fresh air and natural surroundings while receiving the most advanced medical treatments available during the late 19th century. The complex had been constructed using locally quarried granite and featured Gothic Revival architecture that was intended to inspire hope and healing in patients who often arrived expecting never to return home. The sanatorium's main building contained 200 patient rooms, each designed with large windows to maximize natural light and ventilation according to prevailing theories about the therapeutic value of environmental factors in treating chronic diseases. The facility also featured specialized treatment areas, including hydrotherapy rooms, surgical suites equipped with the latest medical instruments, and laboratories where physicians could conduct the bacteriological research that was revolutionizing medical practice during the early 20th century. The sanatorium's reputation had attracted patients from throughout New England and beyond, with wealthy families sending their afflicted relatives to benefit from treatments that combined traditional medical approaches with innovative therapies that emphasized the healing power of environment and lifestyle modification. The facility had employed some of the most respected physicians of the era, including Dr. Edward Blackwood, whose pioneering work in infectious disease research had made him a leading authority on epidemic prevention and treatment. Dr. Edward Blackwood had been recruited to Willowbrook in 1895 specifically because of his expertise in treating complex infectious diseases that had baffled other physicians. His previous work at hospitals in Boston and New York had established his reputation as a brilliant diagnostician who could identify unusual disease patterns and develop innovative treatment protocols that saved patients whom other doctors had given up for lost. His appointment as chief medical officer at Willowbrook had been seen as a major coup for the institution, enhancing its reputation and attracting additional funding from wealthy patrons who sought the best possible care for their afflicted family members. Dr. Morrison's analysis of the mysterious photograph using modern digital enhancement technology revealed details that had been invisible to early 20th century examination methods. The dark markings on the patient's skin appeared to follow the path of blood vessels and lymphatic systems, creating patterns that suggested the disease affected the body's circulatory and immune functions in ways that had never been observed in conventional medical conditions. Most disturbing were the patient's eyes, which showed a reflective quality that seemed almost luminescent, as if the disease had fundamentally altered the structure of the ocular tissues. Advanced photographic analysis confirmed that the image had not been manipulated using any technique available in 1915. The glass plate negative showed no evidence of double exposure, retouching, or composite photography. Spectroscopic analysis of the photographic emulsion revealed that the anomalous characteristics of the patient's appearance had been present at the moment of the photograph's creation, captured by the same lighting conditions that recorded the sanatorium's institutional architecture and medical equipment visible in the background. The digital enhancement process also revealed additional disturbing details that had been obscured by the photograph's age and the poor lighting conditions in the sanatorium's isolation ward. The patient appeared to be wearing a hospital gown that bore stains and discoloration patterns consistent with advanced bodily decay, while the skin visible on their hands and face showed texture changes that suggested the disease had affected the fundamental structure of human tissue. Most remarkably, the enhancement revealed what appeared to be subcutaneous movement beneath the patient's skin, as if something was alive and mobile within their body. If you're as intrigued as we are by these secrets of the past, consider subscribing to not miss any of our future investigations. Dr. Hartwell's research into the historical context surrounding the photograph revealed that the 1915 outbreak at Willowbrook Sanatorium had indeed been associated with a mysterious epidemic that had baffled contemporary medical authorities. The disease, which appeared suddenly in the spring of 1915, had presented symptoms that did not correspond to any known infectious condition, leading doctors to propose various theories about its origin and transmission without ever reaching a scientific consensus about its true nature. The epidemic had begun with the arrival of a single patient, a middle-aged woman named Catherine Mills, who had been transferred to Willowbrook from Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston after developing what physicians had initially diagnosed as an unusual form of consumption. Catherine's condition had deteriorated rapidly, despite the sanatorium's advanced treatments, and within 2 weeks of her arrival, other patients and staff members had begun displaying similar symptoms that suggested the disease was highly contagious, despite precautions taken to prevent its spread. Catherine Mills had arrived at Willowbrook on March 15, 1915, accompanied by her sister Margaret and a detailed medical file that documented 3 months of progressive illness that had resisted all attempts at treatment. The initial symptoms had included persistent fatigue, unexplained weight loss, and a peculiar skin condition that had manifested as dark, thread-like markings that appeared to move beneath the surface of her skin. Boston physicians had initially attributed these symptoms to advanced tuberculosis, complicated by nervous exhaustion, but subsequent examinations had revealed lung tissue that appeared healthy despite Catherine's obvious respiratory distress. Contemporary medical records from the Willowbrook outbreak described symptoms that defied conventional medical understanding. Patients had developed a wasting condition that caused rapid weight loss, extreme pallor, and progressive weakness that eventually led to death within 4 to 6 weeks of initial symptom onset. Most puzzling were the skin changes that had given the disease its colloquial name among sanatorium staff, the blackening, a reference to the dark, vein-like markings that appeared on patients' skin during the advanced stages of the illness. The progression of symptoms had followed a consistent pattern that Dr. Blackwood had documented with obsessive detail in his medical notes. The initial stage involved general malaise and loss of appetite, symptoms that were common to many chronic conditions and initially aroused little concern among medical staff. The second stage was characterized by the appearance of the distinctive dark markings on the skin, typically beginning on the hands and feet, before spreading inward toward the torso. The third stage involved neurological symptoms, including hallucinations, seizures, and episodes of what staff described as supernatural awareness, during which patients claimed to perceive events occurring in distant locations. Dr. Edward Blackwood's personal notes on the epidemic, preserved in the Vermont Medical Society archives, revealed his growing frustration with the disease's resistance to conventional treatment approaches. Despite his extensive experience with infectious diseases, Dr. Blackwood had been unable to identify the causative agent or develop effective treatments for what he described as a condition that appears to attack not merely the body, but the very essence of human vitality itself. The physician's notes revealed that he had attempted every treatment approach available to early 20th century medicine, including mercury compounds, arsenic preparations, and various herbal remedies that had shown promise in treating other wasting conditions. None of these interventions had produced any improvement in patient outcomes, and in several cases, treatment attempts had seemed to accelerate the disease's progression rather than slow it. Most disturbing was Dr. Blackwood's observation that the disease seemed to adapt its behavior in response to treatment efforts, as if it possessed some form of intelligence that allowed it to counter medical interventions. The investigation revealed that the epidemic had spread beyond the confines of the sanatorium to affect the surrounding rural communities, with cases appearing in towns and villages throughout central Vermont during the summer and fall of 1915. Local physicians had reported treating patients who developed identical symptoms, despite having no apparent connection to the sanatorium, suggesting that the disease had established itself in the general population through unknown transmission mechanisms. Dr. Morrison's research revealed that the spread pattern of the epidemic had been unlike anything documented in medical literature. Rather than following the typical progression of infectious diseases, which spread through direct contact or environmental contamination, the mysterious illness had appeared simultaneously in widely separated locations with no identifiable connection between cases. Patients had developed symptoms in towns that were hundreds of miles apart, often on the same day, suggesting that transmission occurred through mechanisms that transcended conventional understanding of how diseases spread. Contemporary newspaper coverage of the epidemic had been surprisingly limited, with most reports focusing on general public health concerns rather than investigating the specific characteristics of the mysterious disease. The Vermont Gazette had published several brief articles describing increased mortality rates in affected communities, but the coverage had avoided detailed discussion of symptoms or transmission patterns that might have created public panic or interfered with ongoing medical investigations. The limited media coverage had been the result of deliberate suppression efforts coordinated by state and federal authorities who recognized that public knowledge of the epidemic's true characteristics might create social chaos that could interfere with America's preparation for potential entry into World War I. Government officials had been particularly concerned about reports that the disease seemed to affect the mind as well as the body, creating symptoms that resembled demonic possession and challenged conventional religious explanations for human suffering. Dr. Morrison's research into government health records from the period revealed that federal and state authorities had been aware of the epidemic's unusual characteristics, but had chosen to classify information about the outbreak to prevent public panic that might have disrupted wartime production and recruitment efforts. The United States had been preparing for potential entry into World War I, and officials had been concerned that reports of a mysterious plague might affect military readiness and civilian morale. The classified documents, declassified in 1975 but never made publicly available until Dr. Morrison's investigation, revealed that government health officials had conducted their own investigation into the epidemic's origins and characteristics. The federal investigation had reached conclusions that differed significantly from the public explanations provided by medical authorities, suggesting that the disease represented something far more disturbing than conventional infectious conditions. According to the classified reports, government investigators had concluded that the epidemic might represent the emergence of a previously unknown pathogen that possessed characteristics unlike any documented infectious agent. The disease appeared to affect patients' cellular structure in ways that suggested viral, bacterial, and parasitic components operating simultaneously, creating a condition that transcended conventional disease categories and challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of infectious processes. The government investigators had been particularly intrigued by reports that the disease seemed to affect patients' consciousness and perceptual abilities, creating symptoms that suggested the pathogen could directly influence brain function in ways that produced what witnesses described as supernatural phenomena. Patients in advanced stages of the illness had reportedly demonstrated knowledge of events occurring in distant locations, communicated with deceased relatives, and displayed other abilities that challenged scientific understanding of human cognitive limitations. The government investigation had also documented evidence suggesting that the disease might possess intelligence-like properties that enabled it to adapt its transmission and symptom presentation based on environmental conditions and host characteristics. This adaptability had made it virtually impossible for medical researchers to develop consistent treatment protocols or prevention strategies, contributing to the high mortality rates observed throughout the affected region. Dr. Hartwell's analysis of contemporary medical journals revealed that similar epidemics had been reported in other regions during the same time period, though the scattered nature of the outbreaks and poor communication between medical communities had prevented recognition of a coordinated pattern. Mysterious wasting diseases had appeared in rural areas of New Hampshire, Maine, and upstate New York during 1915 and 1916, suggesting that the Vermont outbreak represented part of a much larger epidemic that had affected the entire northeastern United States. The research revealed that medical authorities in each affected region had developed different theories about their local outbreaks, attributing the diseases to various environmental factors, nutritional deficiencies, or known infectious agents, despite evidence that contradicted these explanations. The lack of coordination between different medical communities had prevented comprehensive investigation of what appeared to be manifestations of the same underlying pathogen. Investigation into medical records from New Hampshire revealed that physicians at the state hospital in Concord had treated over 40 patients with symptoms identical to those observed at Willowbrook, with cases appearing during the exact same time period as the Vermont outbreak. The New Hampshire patients had displayed the same progression of symptoms, from initial malaise to the appearance of dark skin markings to eventual neurological complications that preceded death. Most remarkably, several New Hampshire patients had mentioned seeing or communicating with Catherine Mills, despite having no known contact with Vermont or the Willowbrook Sanatorium. As we delve deeper into these mysteries, we invite you to join our community of explorers of the inexplicable. Subscribe and become part of the search for truth. Modern analysis of preserved tissue samples from epidemic victims, discovered in the basement storage areas of several New England hospitals, revealed evidence that supported the government investigators' conclusions about the disease's unusual characteristics. The tissue samples showed cellular changes that were unlike anything documented in medical literature, with affected cells displaying hybrid characteristics that seemed to combine human cellular structures with foreign genetic material that could not be identified using current scientific methods. Dr. Lisa Chen, a molecular biologist at Harvard Medical School who had been consulted during the tissue analysis, reported findings that challenged fundamental assumptions about infectious disease mechanisms. The cellular modifications we're observing suggest that this pathogen was capable of directly altering human genetic material in ways that we're only beginning to understand today, Dr. Chen explained. The integration of foreign genetic sequences into human cellular DNA represents a level of biological sophistication that exceeds anything we've encountered in conventional infectious agents. The genetic analysis had revealed that the foreign DNA sequences present in affected tissue samples showed characteristics that were unlike any known terrestrial organisms, with base pair arrangements and protein coding sequences that suggested origins outside conventional evolutionary pathways. The sequences appeared to function as regulatory elements that could control cellular processes in ways that enabled the pathogen to modify human physiology at the most fundamental level. The investigation expanded to include research into the background of Catherine Mills, the patient who had been identified as the probable index case for the Willowbrook outbreak. Dr. Morrison discovered that Catherine had worked as a seamstress in Boston's garment district, where she had been exposed to imported textiles and materials from various international sources during the months preceding her illness. Most significantly, Catherine had been involved in processing fabrics that had been shipped from remote regions of Central Asia, areas that had been experiencing their own mysterious epidemics during the same time period. Catherine Mills's employment records revealed that she had worked for the Blackwood Textile Company, a firm that specialized in importing exotic fabrics and materials from regions that were rarely visited by Western traders. The company had maintained business relationships with suppliers in Tibet, Mongolia, and other remote areas where traditional societies had preserved knowledge of textiles that incorporated unusual materials and processing techniques that were unknown to Western manufacturers. The Blackwood Textile Company had been established in 1885 by Jonathan Blackwood, a distant relative of Dr. Edward Blackwood, As an enterprise that capitalized on growing American demand for exotic fabrics and decorative materials that reflected the Victorian era's fascination with foreign cultures and mysterious traditions. The company had built its reputation by importing materials that other firms considered too difficult or dangerous to handle, establishing trade relationships in regions where Western influence was minimal and traditional practices remained unchanged by industrial development. The investigation revealed that several of Catherine's co-workers at the textile company had also developed mysterious illnesses during the months preceding the Willowbrook outbreak, though their conditions had been attributed to various conventional causes rather than being recognized as manifestations of the same underlying disease. The pattern suggested that the pathogen had been introduced through infected materials that had been processed by multiple workers before Catherine's more severe symptoms had led to her hospitalization. Dr. Morrison's research into the Blackwood Textile Company's import records revealed that the firm had been receiving shipments from regions that were experiencing significant social and environmental disruption during 1914 and 1915. Political upheaval, military conflicts, and natural disasters had displaced traditional communities that had maintained ancient knowledge about dangerous materials and the protective practices necessary for safe handling of certain organic substances. The company's correspondence files, preserved in the Boston Public Library's business archives, revealed that several shipments received during 1914 had been accompanied by unusual warnings from suppliers who urged extreme caution in handling materials that they described as blessed by the old spirits and dangerous to those who lack proper preparation. These warnings had been dismissed by company officials as superstitious nonsense, but the timing of their receipt corresponded exactly with the period when Catherine and her co-workers had begun developing their mysterious symptoms. The disruption of traditional knowledge systems had apparently led to the improper handling and export of materials that contained pathogens or biological agents that had been safely contained for centuries through cultural practices that were not understood by Western traders. The introduction of these dangerous materials into Western commercial systems had created opportunities for previously contained biological threats to spread throughout populations that lacked immunity or cultural knowledge necessary for protection. Modern microbiological analysis of textile samples from the Blackwood Company's archives revealed the presence of organic compounds that appeared to be related to the pathogen responsible for the 1915 epidemic. The compounds showed characteristics that suggested they were derived from living organisms that possessed properties unlike any known biological agents, supporting theories that the epidemic had been caused by exposure to previously unknown forms of life that had evolved in isolation from mainstream biological systems. The textile analysis had been conducted using advanced spectroscopic techniques that could identify trace biological materials that had been preserved within fiber structures for over a century. The results indicated that the imported fabrics had contained dormant biological agents that had remained viable despite extended storage and transportation, suggesting that the pathogen possessed exceptional survival capabilities that enabled it to remain infectious under conditions that would destroy conventional microorganisms. Dr. Chen's laboratory had identified specific textile fibers that showed evidence of biological modification, with organic components that appeared to have been deliberately incorporated into the fabric structure rather than representing accidental contamination. The modification patterns suggested that traditional craftspeople had possessed sophisticated knowledge about biological agents and had intentionally created textiles that served as preservation and delivery systems for these organisms. Dr. Hartwell's investigation revealed that the 1915 epidemic had ended as suddenly as it had begun, with new cases ceasing to appear after December 1916, despite the absence of effective treatments or public health interventions that might have controlled the outbreak. The sudden termination of the epidemic suggested that the pathogen had either exhausted its ability to spread within the affected population or had undergone evolutionary changes that reduced its virulence and transmissibility. Contemporary medical observers had attributed the epidemic's end to various factors, including improved sanitation, better nutrition, or natural development of population immunity, though none of these explanations adequately accounted for the rapidity with which new cases had disappeared. The government investigators had theorized that the pathogen might have completed some form of biological cycle that had temporarily satisfied its reproductive or adaptive requirements, leading to a dormant phase that could potentially reactivate under appropriate environmental conditions. The investigation revealed that authorities had made deliberate efforts to suppress information about the epidemic's true characteristics, destroying medical records, relocating surviving patients to distant facilities, and prohibiting discussion of the outbreak's unusual features among medical personnel who had witnessed the events. The cover-up had been so successful that knowledge of the epidemic's true nature had been lost within a few years of its conclusion, leaving only sanitized accounts that attributed the mortality to conventional diseases. Dr. Morrison's research into the subsequent history of the Willowbrook Sanatorium revealed that the facility had been permanently closed in 1920, officially due to financial difficulties, but actually because the building had become uninhabitable due to what staff members described as persistent contamination that could not be eliminated through conventional cleaning and disinfection procedures. Several attempts to reopen the facility during the 1920s and 1930s had been abandoned when new occupants developed mysterious illnesses that resembled the symptoms observed during the 1915 outbreak. The abandoned sanatorium had become the subject of local folklore during the decades following its closure, with residents of nearby communities reporting strange phenomena, including unexplained lights, unusual sounds, and sightings of figures that resembled former patients wandering the empty corridors. Several attempts to demolish the building during the 1940s and 1950s had been abandoned when construction workers developed illnesses that forced suspension of the demolition activities. Modern environmental analysis of the abandoned sanatorium building revealed the continued presence of biological agents that appeared to be related to the original pathogen, suggesting that the infectious agent had established a permanent presence within the facility's structure. The contamination appeared to be concentrated in areas that had been used for isolation and treatment of the most severely affected patients, particularly the basement morgue, where bodies had been prepared for burial during the epidemic's peak. The environmental contamination had been detected using advanced biological sensors that could identify genetic material from microorganisms that were not present in standard environmental samples. The results indicated that the pathogen had undergone evolutionary changes during the century since the original outbreak, but had retained core characteristics that made it recognizable as being related to the original epidemic agent. Dr. Chen's team had established that the environmental contamination showed signs of active biological processes, suggesting that the pathogen continued to maintain viable populations within the abandoned building despite the absence of human hosts. The organism appeared to have adapted to survival in building materials, possibly utilizing cellulose, limestone, and other structural components as nutrient sources that enabled continued existence in dormant or alternative life stages. The investigation expanded to include research into similar abandoned medical facilities throughout the northeastern United States, seeking evidence of comparable contamination or historical outbreaks that might indicate the wider distribution of the pathogen or its evolutionary descendants. Dr. Morrison discovered that several abandoned hospitals and sanatoriums in the region showed evidence of persistent biological contamination that had prevented their reuse for decades after their official closure. The Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts had been permanently abandoned in 1992 after renovation workers developed mysterious illnesses that resembled the symptoms observed during the 1915 outbreak. The Norwich State Hospital in Connecticut had experienced similar problems during attempted renovations in 1987, with multiple construction workers requiring hospitalization for conditions that included the distinctive skin markings and neurological symptoms that characterized the original epidemic. The pattern of abandoned medical facilities suggested that the 1915 epidemic had been more widespread and persistent than official records indicated, with multiple institutions becoming permanently contaminated and unusable following treatment of patients with the mysterious disease. The concentration of abandoned facilities in areas that had experienced the highest mortality during the epidemic supported theories that the pathogen had established permanent environmental reservoirs that continued to pose risks to human health. Dr. Hartwell's final analysis of the 1915 photograph concluded that it represented unprecedented documentation of a biological threat that had challenged early 20th century medical understanding and continued to pose potential risks to contemporary public health. The image provided evidence that infectious diseases could possess characteristics that transcended conventional biological categories, creating conditions that required entirely new approaches to medical research and epidemic prevention. The investigation revealed that Catherine Mills, the patient captured in the photograph, had likely been patient zero not just for the Willowbrook outbreak, but for a much larger epidemic that had affected the entire northeastern United States. Her exposure to imported biological agents through her work in the textile industry had introduced a previously unknown pathogen into human populations that lacked natural immunity or cultural knowledge necessary for protection against its effects. The research had broader implications for understanding the relationship between global trade, environmental disruption, and emerging infectious disease threats. The 1915 epidemic had demonstrated how commercial activities could inadvertently introduce biological agents from isolated ecosystems into vulnerable populations, creating pandemic conditions that could overwhelm medical resources and threaten social stability. Modern epidemiologists consulted during the investigation acknowledged that similar pathways for disease emergence continued to exist in contemporary global trade systems, with international commerce creating opportunities for novel pathogens to spread rapidly throughout interconnected human populations. The 1915 epidemic provided crucial insights into how such threats might manifest and the importance of maintaining surveillance systems that could detect unusual disease patterns before they developed into major outbreaks. The discovery of the photograph had also provided important lessons about the dangers of suppressing information about unusual disease outbreaks, demonstrating how cover-ups could prevent the development of effective prevention and treatment strategies while allowing dangerous pathogens to persist in environmental reservoirs where they could threaten future generations. The government's decision to classify information about the 1915 epidemic had contributed to the loss of valuable medical knowledge that might have prevented similar outbreaks or enabled more effective responses to comparable threats. In her concluding report, Dr. Morrison reflected on the profound implications of the 1915 epidemic for understanding the relationship between human health, environmental stability, and global interconnectedness. The photograph of Catherine Mills served as a reminder that infectious diseases could possess characteristics that challenged fundamental assumptions about biological processes, requiring constant vigilance and adaptive approaches to medical research and public health protection. The story of Patient Zero reminds us that the boundaries between known and unknown biological threats are more permeable than we typically recognize, and that our interconnected global systems create constant opportunities for novel pathogens to emerge from isolated environments and threaten human populations that lack adequate defenses. The mysterious epidemic of 1915 demonstrates that some biological threats operate according to principles that transcend conventional medical understanding, requiring humility about the limits of scientific knowledge and preparedness for challenges that may exceed our current capabilities. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the persistent contamination of the Willowbrook Sanatorium and similar facilities suggests that some infectious agents can establish permanent environmental presence that continues to pose risks long after initial outbreaks have ended. The photograph that captured Catherine Mills in her final days continues to serve as evidence that biological threats can lurk within the most ordinary aspects of human civilization, waiting for opportunities to emerge when environmental conditions or human activities create pathways for their spread. The past guards secrets that challenge comprehension, and what we've uncovered in the shadows of that abandoned sanatorium reveals that some diseases transcend our understanding of biological processes, creating threats that can persist across generations while remaining hidden from conventional detection methods. Perhaps the real question isn't whether similar pathogens exist today, but whether we have the scientific sophistication and social courage to recognize and address biological threats that operate according to principles we have yet to understand. The true nature of this mystery remains in the shadows, but we want to know your opinion. Use the comments section below and tell us what you believe. If you are fascinated by unraveling the secrets behind our darkest histories, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications, for there is much more to be unmasked.